For Ali, being new is getting old. But at this school, she discovers that nothing is what it seems. Where there is a sword, there is also an enemy. And where there is a dream, there is also a path. Avalon High premieres the 19th of February on Disney Channel.
Hello Internet, I'm the Disney Brain and welcome to the DCOM Review. Coming off the heels of one of the lesser movies I've reviewed, it only seems right to flip the script by talking about what happens when director Stuart Gillard gets it right. He's an interesting director, albeit a very inconsistent one, and even though a fair chunk of you really wanted this movie reviewed, it still strikes me as one of the more underwatched and underappreciated DCOMs in recent memory. But were the masses right to stay away from it, or is there more there than meets the eye? Well, let's find out. Major spoiler warnings going into this one. No, seriously, if you haven't seen this movie yet, abandon ship on this video because the way certain events transpire really matters here. I'd say more so than any other DCOM created. Just don't say I didn't warn you. With all that said, let's take a closer look at Avalon High. We start things off with a really cool looking dream sequence before our lead character wakes up from said dream. It kind of goes without saying that the dream she had will be reincorporated later on. Our lead is named Ali Pennington, portrayed by Britt Robertson, who has done her fair share of big screen films in the aftermath of this movie. The Pennington family has recently moved, which seems to happen a lot to them, and Ali is transferred to Avalon High. It's also important to mention that her parents are both experts on Arthurian history, which is more than a little convenient, but I think these parents do a good job throughout the movie of acting like both parents and scholars in that very specific field, as opposed to just scholars there to dole out exposition when needed, so it's easy to forgive. So she goes for a run and meets Will Wagner, portrayed by Greg Sulkin, who many of you might recognize from his werewolf days on Wizards of Waverly Place. And then later, at school, she meets Will again in addition to his girlfriend Jan and his best friend Lance. Soon we find ourselves in the classroom, where we get our introduction to Miles, portrayed by Joey Polari, the two-time nominated and one-time winner of the Young Artist Award for his acting, and easily one of the best supporting characters in any DCOM, but we'll get more into him later. For now, Miles and Ali eventually become friends after they're forced to work on a group project together regarding the Order of the Bear. The Order is a secret society established in the time of King Arthur who believe that King Arthur will be reincarnated to bring the world out of turmoil. This finding sets the stage for everything that is reincorporated from Arthurian times into this modern day story, including the bit we learned earlier about Arthur's closest friends basically stabbing him in the back. A point that becomes very clear later on, when Ali actually sees Lance and Jen together at school, all while she's getting closer and closer to Will through running and friend burgers, and eventually gets invited to a party that Will is hosting. This presents as good a time as any to talk about Marco, Will's dick of a stepbrother, or at least alleged dick of a stepbrother. He's framed in such a way that you pretty much assume he's up to no good from the jump, but that is one of the many things that makes this movie brilliant. So it's at this party that the Jen and Lance backstabbing becomes even more evident, but Jen urges Ali to keep it a secret for now. At this point in the film, we are also well acquainted with Miles and his ability to know things before they happen. I like the way they use and eventually develop this power because the temptation would be to use it to solve every problem, but they keep the happenstantial nature of his powers consistent until he needs to control them later on. And it's from that power that a secret page of the Order of the Bear book is discovered, informing our heroes that the day of the big game is also the day that King Arthur is prophesied to return. But before that big game, things start going really wrong for Will, who at this point has everyone who believes the prophecy convinced that he is the reincarnated King Arthur. He gets caught for cheating even though he didn't really cheat, in a pretty brilliant move by the still unrevealed Mordred, a character that functions in direct opposition to King Arthur, making Marco the obvious choice for the reincarnated version of him. There is also unrest amongst the football team, which has been ongoing since their previous loss, one directly caused by Lance. Hey, wait a minute. It seems to me that over the course of this film, Lance is causing just as much turmoil as Marco does, but in a less obvious way. Another brilliant move on the part of this movie, because once you realize that, you start thinking that even though Marco is the obvious choice, he might be the overly obvious choice, and perhaps the real Mordred would act in much subtler ways. Perhaps the real Mordred would act friendly, act like an ally until the time was right. Getting back to the plot, Will gets to the big game early, and he finally witnesses what almost everyone else already knows. This sends him scampering off with the speedy Ali in hot pursuit. Then she tries to tell Will everything about his destiny and King Arthur, but Will takes it more as a metaphorical pep talk. But he also says that Ali would be the reason that the knights were united. And if you know how everything in this film plays out, then that is a beautiful foreshadow because that statement has a double meaning. So Will returns to the game, but things still aren't going so hot, and at halftime, he gives kind of a meh speech, but it somehow gets his team riled up, so they're all ready to go. But while Will is going back to get his helmet, he's missing once again, and now it's on Miles to use his powers, this time willingly, to find him. This brings them to the school theater, a pretty fitting location for what's about to go down, and it's revealed in the film's first major twist that not Marco, not Lance, but the history teacher Mr. Moore was Mordred the entire time. And then, in the movie's final twist, it turns out Will Wagner is not the reincarnation of King Arthur, but Allie is. This leads to a wonderfully staged scene where the Knights of Good battle back Mordred, and his powers are pretty awesome actually, and there's something to be said for the fact that these made-for-TV movie fights look genuinely better than the CGI used in some big screen, bigger budget action films. So eventually, our hero stops Mordred and he's taken into custody, which could have been a setup for a potential sequel, but unfortunately that didn't and likely never will happen. So the film ends with Will winning the big game, even though to be fair, his team kept it pretty close without him. Him and Allie end up together because movie, then we close on one of the best shots ever captured in a DCOM, all the swords together at the round table. And now, the characters. There's quite a bit of minor characters, but one of the more salient positive features of this film is how well they're utilized throughout the story. Allie's parents have their enjoyable quirks and have just the right amount of screen time, so they never feel completely overutilized as either parents or King Arthur experts. Lance functions well as a minor character because when you really think about it, he doesn't seem like that bad of a choice for Mordred, and if that had ended up being the twist, then the movie still would have made sense. And most importantly, Mr. Moore, who stands tall as easily the best villain ever constructed by Stuart Gillard. Not that he had tough competition or anything. He's framed as an energetic Arthurian geek, and all of his actions could easily be interpreted as normal given who he is and what his interests are. But what makes him a good villain is the way he acts before his intentions are revealed. Phantos was all kinds of terrible at acting innocent, but Mr. Moore, through both the casual and more dramatic stuff, looks and acts the part, making the eventual reveal that much more jarring, but still sensible. Marco is a fairly standard character, but I like the fact that this movie didn't just make him a prototypical bully just for the sake of having one. They gave him enough of a backstory and a believable enough reason to resent Will, so potentially being Mordred wouldn't ever be out of the realm of possibility. But even when watching the movie for the first time, I could tell he was just a little too evil to be the real threat. In fact, I thought it would end up being Lance because of the fact that many of his actions had a direct negative impact on Will, and maybe Mordred was one of those guys that kept enemies closest. So for me, the end reveal was a double twist. But I do like what they did with Marco here because I felt that making him overly evil was intentional, and if you're like me and never really bought him as Mordred, then you're forced to think of other possibilities. Miles is a great character, and Joey Polari gets almost every detail about his socially awkward, somewhat neurotic, and snarky character right. His performance is really good for the same reason that I thought Sterling Knight was really good as Christopher Wilde in Starstruck, in the sense that both nail the nuances and don't sell you short on the minor details that create a more believable whole. And I appreciate the way that his powers function consistently as visions that he can't really control until he has to. Even though some of his visions were relatively well timed, all things considered, it's nothing immersion shattering, so it's not really a flaw, more of a feature. So with all that, it's not really a huge surprise that he was nominated for a Young Artist Award for his performance here. Greg Sulkin is, well, not as great here as he could have been. That's not to say that he's terrible in this movie, far from it, but it's really distracting to hear his attempt at an American accent when most people who know who he is also know that he's not American. He's still a good character and properly framed in such a way that if he had ended up being King Arthur, it wouldn't have been that much of a surprise. It would have made for a much more predictable and plain movie, but it would have made sense all the same. But I just wasn't overly impressed by his acting here. It was good, but just not great, which is fine here because the focus of this movie isn't really on him. It's more about Britt Robertson, and her character of Allie was great. Allie kind of functions similar to Maddie Dolan from Tiger Cruise in the sense that they are both strong-willed female leads that can properly balance being somewhat guarded and then flip that to become heavily involved in the situation they find themselves in because they have to. She's also quite smart, athletic, and has enough common sense to deal with drama and other such situations in the best possible way as opposed to acting reactively. In addition to that, she really understands her character as a perpetual new girl and how that reality would impact her interactions with other people. The realization that she was in fact the reincarnation of King Arthur wasn't just some female empowerment narrative thrown in there at the last second. Her actions through every plot point earned the movie the right to sensibly put her in an end position where she was the hero that the film needed, and it works so well here. There's a lot of great female lead performances in DCOMs, and I'm not quite sure where she would rank, but she's definitely one of the better ones. And that's Avalon High. So, what's the verdict? Avalon High is a great movie with great visuals, a powerful and moving score that is likely one of the all-time best in any DCOM, and fits seamlessly into the variety of tones that the movie goes for, in addition to great actors pretty much across the board, and not one, but two great twists that put this film on a whole other level relative to its peers. The visuals work well because the Arthurian iconography is used just enough and never feels overused. it makes sense that Allie would be the kind of character to see visions of knights, not just because she eventually ends up being King Arthur, but because she was raised by two individuals that can't stop talking about King Arthur and the time period that he resided in. Add that to the fact that their family is never really in one place for very long, and you get the end result where Allie is quite literally seeing Arthur in everything, because Arthur is one of the only constants in her life. Which is a little overt, but Stuart Gillard tends to favor a lot of overt aspects in his films, which is also present in the writing, which I would say is at times too overt. And I do think that between Read It and Weep and Dadnapped, Paul Hoen gets more out of using the lead character's headspace as a means to progress a story, but that's a whole other video. But this movie can also be subtle as well. You'll notice that there's a few scenes that show Caesar, the Shakespearean play that, not coincidentally, also features a plot about two people very close to a ruler who end up stabbing him in the back. Just a brilliant detail to include. In addition, the high school drama aspects of the film intentionally take a backseat to the lore, the prophecy, and the history of Arthurian times. The fact that Will is an athlete isn't really important. What's important is that he's a leader. The trials and tribulations of high school aren't really addressed here because the point is to create a narrative focused on King Arthur, using school not as an end-all be-all like too many movies do, but as a conduit. And because the movie takes that angle, it places a larger emphasis on solving the mystery of who's King Arthur and who's Mordred, and that's where the film shines most of all. The handling and eventual reveal of Mordred was a great example of a live-action multiple-choice question where you have the answer that seems obvious, but it's just there to trick you, the answer that could be right, but you don't really consider it unless you think about it a bit more, and then the right answer, which is harder to get to. If you know the reveal, then hindsight makes it a little easier to pick up on certain tells that would clue you in on Mr. Moore's true identity. But without that knowledge, the right answer is harder to come by, and that mystery element is handled exceptionally well. But it gets even better, since there's an overwhelming amount of evidence that suggests that Will is King Arthur, only to realize that the strong, capable female lead, who would still be strong and capable, even without the title of Your Highness, ends up being the real Arthur. This works well too, because if you think about it, Miles, with his visions and natural connection to this mythical otherworld, could have also been King Arthur, and if that had ended up being the twist, it would also make sense, because he's also tortured by Marco in the movie, meaning that the same logic behind Marco possibly being Mordred could also potentially lead one to at least suspect that Miles could have been King Arthur. I think the Mordred reveal is handled a bit better comparing the two, but they are both arguably the greatest aspects of this film. This movie isn't perfect, however, and a lot of that has to do with the writing and the screenplay. Some of the dialogue is a bit bland, and other times you just don't need words because you could have said the exact same thing in a more subtle way, through just expressions or just actions instead of literally blurting out what you're likely already thinking about while watching events transpire. The problem is a systemic one, so I feel like this film could have been a top 5 all-time DCOM as opposed to top 10 if it had embraced just a little bit more subtlety. Because when this film is subtle, it's movie magic, so it stands to reason that it could have been that much better. All in all, Avalon High is a brilliant, beautiful, and well-constructed film from the start, and even more so on the finish. While you have some writing that could have been a bit better and some relatively convenient situations, I don't think any of that takes away fully from the incredible things this movie did that no DCOM before it or since has even attempted. And the saddest part about all of that is somehow Twitches, the worst movie Stuart Gillard ever filmed, got a sequel, and yet the best movie he's ever filmed gets nothing. A sequel could have opened so many doors to a lot more legends, myths, tales. There's so much history to choose from, and opportunities to educate the viewership through an engaging medium in the same way that The Color of Friendship probably got some people to look further into the South African apartheid. But I digress. If you love Britt Robertson, love Arthurian or medieval iconography or legends, love an engaging but not overly obvious mystery, or just plain love good movies, then this one's for you. Although I really do hope that if you've gotten this far, that you've seen the movie first, because as I mentioned, you really do owe it to yourself to go in spoiler free. But if you haven't managed to see it yet, then it kind of goes without saying that I would highly recommend this film. But, as I often say, the only way to know for sure is to give it a watch and decide how good it is for yourself. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, go ahead and leave a like, sub for more, and share the legend of Queen Arthur everywhere. And don't forget to follow the Disney Brain on Facebook and Twitter for updates. Links down below. The coming days will bring the return of the Girl Meets World review, where we'll be talking about both Girl Meets Bear and Girl Meets the Great Lady of New York. That review will make video number 99, and you already know it's coming for video number 100, so lots to look forward to. Until then...